Welcome to the Hope After Child Loss podcast, where we endeavor to offer stories of hope to grieving parents and siblings so that they might rediscover life filled with meaning, purpose, and hope. We invite you to come and join us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hope After Child Loss. I'm your host, Greg Buffkin, and we're really glad you could join us today. Hey guys, my guest today is Terry Sternad. Did I pronounce that correctly, Terry?
Close enough.
Close enough. Okay. All right. Very good. Well, listen, Terry, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you as our guest.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. I like actually telling one story and what God's done in my life.
Great. Well, I know from our previous conversation that you do have quite a story. So before we jump into that, though, Terry, I'd like for you just to take a couple of minutes and tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and where you are today and a little about your family.
Sure. So I'm in Cape Coral, Florida right now, which for all the people north, you think it's typically warm. It was 55 degrees this morning, which is really cold down here.
That is cold for Florida.
Sweatshirt and a jacket and out walking the dogs, but it's nice and sunny, and it'll be in the mid upper 60s today. So that's all good. So
yeah.
But anyhow, we're in Cape Coral. I've been married to my wife, and this is not the mother of the child that I lost, but for 22, it'll be 22 years, I think. I'll get in trouble if that's wrong, but I think 22.
Yeah, you will. Congratulations.
So we actually dated a little bit in high school and then kind of went our separate ways, and through some class reunions and classmates.com kind of got back together, and she has two boys and I have two girls, and it's been a pretty good life.
Oh, that's great. That is great. Well, listen, I would like to give you the platform now to share the story, as you referred to a minute ago, of losing your son, Terry Jr. And it's for our listeners, it's been quite a long time for Terry. That you'll hear as he shares that it might as well have been yesterday. You don't ever get over it, do you, Terry?
No. We were talking at Grief Share last night, and I think the best definition that I've ever heard for what happens or what should happen is that recovery is not like forgetting the past, but it's not letting the pain of the past keep you from going forward.
Well, that's a great way to put it.
Because it doesn't ever go away totally.
Right.
But it certainly doesn't keep you from having joy in your life again, and it doesn't keep you from having a good life serving the Lord and being with your family and having a good time in life again. But doesn't mean that pain ever goes away.
No, that is so true. And sometimes that it does take a while to heal through that recovery process on your grief journey to get to that place where you can enjoy life again and find meaning and purpose, doesn't it?
It does, man.
Yeah.
It's interesting. When I think back on it, I should have kept a journal, but I can't tell you, exactly or, ballpark when that kind of happened.
Right.
It was certainly years, not months, but, probably in 2 years, things were a little better, and 3 years more. By 5 years, maybe it was pretty good. And, now I'm at 40 years. So, been a long time. But life's been good for a long time. It didn't take 40 years to get to this place, fortunately.
Right.
With God's help.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that people who are listening today are kind of looking for is if they're in a fresh season of grief, as
Right.
you and I both remember back from those early days, you just kind of want to have some reassurance that life will be worth living again, and that there will be some joy again, and you will survive this and be able not to just get by or survive, but that you can thrive again. And that's what we want people to hear as we share our stories and talk about our own grief journeys.
Absolutely. And, I'm sure one of the things that a lot of people have talked about, to be able to use that experience to help others.
Yeah.
Probably the heart of the joy in my life now. I mean,
Yeah.
it's such a blessing. I do talk about a little bit, but I lead grief share groups. And gosh, I get to see God show up in people's lives all the time in these grief share groups. And we do some other things at church and small groups and things. So any time that we get to have God use us to help others and use the experience that we've had to enable us to connect with people in a way that others that haven't had that experience can connect is probably is the biggest source of joy. Certainly normal life is good too now. Family things and going out to dinner with friends. We've got a strong group of Christian friends, and all that stuff adds joy to life.
And it's absolutely what you said is so true. And it's also it gives us an opportunity to honor our children as we share our stories and as we come alongside and help other people as well, whether it's through grief share or whether it's meeting with someone one-on-one who is in a fresh season of grief. And it is incredibly fulfilling and meaningful to be able to do that. Terry, I'd like for you, if you don't mind, to take us back in time to that date. I think you said that you had told me before it was in December of 1983. So you don't have to go into any more detail than you want to, but to give our listeners the context of where you've come from, would you just talk a little about that?
Sure. Is it okay if I kind of go back before that a little bit to set the stage of how God prepared me for that day when I didn't even believe in him, didn't think he existed. So
absolutely.
So I'll kind of go through the whole thing. But basically, I grew up not in a Christian household. We got dragged off to church when we were little, but that ended by the time we were 10 or so, and it just wasn't a part of my life. Went through college, got married, had 2 kids, including the one I lost. Thinking that, what, if I can't see it, feel it, and touch it, it just doesn't exist. So that was kind of my mindset, and several things happened that clearly, with hindsight, it was God arranging in my life to kind of get me to the point where I'd accept him. So the first thing was kind of odd. There was a movie called The Ghost of Flight 401 about a Eastern Airlines flight that went down in the Everglades. And the flight engineer died in that crash. Afterwards, on other Eastern Airline flights, crew members would report seeing this flight engineer. And it turned out that every time on every flight where somebody reported seeing this flight engineer, that plane had salvaged parts from the one that crashed, and he lost his life in it. And it just... And it seemed, there were enough reports, and I read the book then, and I read some other books on supernatural, and it cracked the door open that there's another realm of things for me. But again, I just happened to see this movie. Jump ahead to probably 1982, maybe. We lived in Denver at the time. I worked downtown Denver, lived in the suburbs. We had a guy that worked for us who his wife didn't work. He didn't have a high paying job with our company and only had one car, so that was a problem for him. So I started giving him a ride to work. Um, he was probably the most evangelistic person I've still come across in my life. We spent lots of rides back and forth to work talking about God and Christianity and prayer and salvation and eternal security and all kinds of things. And through that, I learned a lot. I didn't believe it. I frankly listened just because I was polite, even in my pre-Christian days. But I learned a lot, really a lot about Christ, a lot about prayer and salvation. So jump ahead now to 1983, which is the year my son died. We had a really great dog that died in May after spending a lot of money trying to save this dog. After the dog died, we were big dog, still am big dog person. My wife and I, previous wife, were sad and we couldn't talk to each other about it without making each other sad. So I'd call my mom and I'd talk to her about it. And these were, my mom and I always got along fine, had a good relationship, but maybe like a lot of guys, not a lot of intimate feeling conversations. So talking about my dog to her was probably some of the most intimate conversations I'd had with her as a 30-year-old adult at that point. So 2 weeks after the dog died, I get a call from my dad, and he said there's something wrong with my mom, and turned out she'd had a massive heart attack. They took her to the hospital in a helicopter, but it was too late, and she was just gone.
Wow.
So this was like June 6th of 1983. She was only, it was 2 days before her birthday. She would have been 56, so pretty young.
Yeah.
No history of heart problems, just gone. So at that point, I started to kind of want the things that I'd heard from my friend on all these car rides to be true. And I actually bought a Bible and read it for a little bit, but after a couple of months, it just didn't stick to me. I kind of just went back to my former way of thinking. So now, jump ahead, just almost right at 6 months from that, December 3rd, 1983. It's a Saturday, and we're going to a horseback riding lesson. My daughter, who was 8 at the time, we'd started her in lessons on her 5th birthday, and that was pretty much our Saturday routine. We'd go to the stables, and she'd take her riding lesson. My son was always with us, and he'd just kind of play around the stables and do things a 6-year-old boy likes to do. There's a lot of things around the stables, and he'd be with us some, and he'd be off some. So she finished her lesson, and we spent a little extra time buying my daughter a new saddle on that day. And on that day, it had snowed maybe 5 or 6 inches and was pretty cold. So the riding lesson was inside. But when we finished buying her a new saddle and getting that done, we went to get my son because we were going to take a picture of the kids on the horse and use that for our Christmas card that year. So we went to find him and couldn't find him right away, which wasn't an immediate concern. It's there's a lot of places around the stable that a 6-year-old boy can get into and have some fun, and we'd been doing this for many years, or 3 years, I guess, at this point. So we weren't too concerned, but we kept looking, still couldn't find him. So I don't know, it's hard to remember the exact time frames, but 10, 15 minutes of looking for him and we can't find him. And now we're getting pretty panicked. So we had other people at the stables looking for him. Still couldn't find him. We called the sheriff. Sheriff came out, helped us look for him, and we still couldn't find him. So I was looking kind of in some different areas, and actually there's a creek that goes through the stable or through the property, and actually got down in the creek to try to look under ice that was kind of out from the edges and couldn't find him. But eventually I found some footprints, and followed the footprints, and there was a place where the creek was deeper and kind of pooled. It was mostly 2 feet deep, but at this place it was maybe 8 feet deep, and there was a bridge that went across it, and footprints went down there, and there was a thin layer of ice over the water at that point because it was more of a pool, and the ice was broken through. And by this time, we'd been looking for him for quite a while, and I thought, that's probably him, and it had just been too long. He can't be alive at this point. So, so I went and got the sheriff. He came, and they called. They actually have a cold water diving team, and so they had them come out, and they went in and found him in the water, pulled him out. I remember still that I asked if I could touch him even, and yeah, they had him wrapped up. So I went over and just touched his face, and put him in an ambulance and took him to the hospital. My wife and actually her parents were with us this day. There was a house at the stables, and they waited there, and I followed behind in a sheriff's car and went to the hospital. So they got him in, and actually the fastest way that you can warm somebody's body is to put them on a heart and lung machine, just like they do for heart surgery. And that was going to take some time. And I was in the waiting room, and I think, I don't know if I can define the exact moment, but I prayed and asked God for His will to be done. And actually, my conversations, had taught me enough to know that when you pray, you want to pray for God's will, not your own will to be done. And I did that, and I called my friend and asked him to pray. And he actually, I thought he was going to pray for my son, but he actually prayed for me.
This is the friend that you had had several rides back and forth to work with, and who had shared Jesus with you.
Yeah, Don was his name, and so he was my Christian contact, I guess. So I called him, and so they came out after a little while and told me that it was going to really take some time for this to warm his body, and that if I wanted to, I could go back to where my wife and daughter and in-law, father and mother-in-law were. So I did that, and we went back there, and we're calling some people and telling them what happened. And so we got a call from the hospital that said they'd actually got a heartbeat back, and they'd had a heartbeat for about 45 minutes. So we're obviously excited. We're kind of getting put together to go back to the hospital. And before we left, we got another call that said his heart had given out. It had just suffered too much damage from lack of oxygen for too long a period of time. So we went home without our son. And, in the days immediately after, we had a lot of people staying at our house. And on 2 separate occasions, I was just feeling overwhelmed and went upstairs to our bedroom to get away from all the people. And both times when I did that, I just cried out, just God help me. And both times when I did that, I felt His touch, I believe. It wasn't like everything was better, but it calmed me enough to not just feel totally overwhelmed at the time.
Yeah. You felt His presence in that moment, right?
I did. And I still look back at that as kind of a real bedrock of my faith, just knowing that He touched me at that time. So after that, everybody leaves after a while. Started going to church, actually a church that my friend who I'd given the car rides to recommended to me. Wasn't the church that he went to because he thought that his church might be a little intense for a new Christian, but it was a good Bible-believing church. And again, God worked that out. I'm sure it was a very small church, maybe 35 people. There was a couple there that had lost a child to meningitis a few years earlier, and we kind of bonded over our loss. And the pastor and his wife did a Bible study just for me and my wife at his house, and started getting into the Bible and going to church. And that kind of started me on my Christian walk. And while I wish I could say that everything was perfect after I became a Christian, I still had some issues that had kind of plagued me in our marriage before. And we ended up getting divorced, but actually it's not because of the loss, just because of other issues that we'd both had before.
That just kind of became a precipitating factor that led
Actually,
you.
not really, Greg. That
No.
probably actually drew us closer together. That wasn't enough to overcome past problems and things. So,
Right.
that was some time later.
Yeah.
So, getting into churches, I always would get involved somehow in church, doing different things. And then 7 years ago, I got tied into grief share, and that has just been such a blessing in my life, because it's not only a way to serve, but it lets me use my experience of that loss to connect to other people. And I just think that's what God made me for. That's kind of where I'm supposed to be. And I would tell you, and not just since Grief Share started, as I mentioned before, that God's been so good, and just, and him being able to use that experience in my life, and just different things. I've taught a Bible study for a long time, and I've done a lot of things, but that's really been the joy of my life, is being able to serve him and serve others.
Yeah.
And through walking with him, for 40 years now, that's what's made life be good. I can't imagine my life without him.
Yeah, that's an incredible testimony, Terry, and it goes back to the promise of Romans 8:28, that where Scripture tells us that, as you just said, God works all things together for good, and that includes the things that, from all outward appearances, the things that feel so horrible and that are so tragic. Only he can take something like that and bring good out of it. Was it a good thing to lose Terry Jr.? No, of course not.
No.
And you wouldn't have traded anything to be able to you would have traded anything to still be able to have Terry Jr. in your life today. But God, in his sovereignty and in his love and grace, can take something like that and bring good things from it. And a prime example is what you're doing now to be able to help other people. And I want to go back to something you mentioned, Grief Share, and you discovered it, I think you said, about 7 years ago.
Right.
So you're about 33 years into grief,
right,
before you even found out about it. Man, don't you wish that somebody had told you about it early on in that process?
I do, but I also trust in God's timing. I just think that when I found it, that was the right time for me.
Right.
I'm not sure why or what, but I believe that God works in our lives every day, and I think that it was just his timing.
Yeah.
So I'm good with it. I've got, hopefully have a few years left to keep doing that. And
I hope you do too.
Yeah, we're right about the same age, as I recall from our earlier conversation. So
I believe so. Yeah, we're both just north of 40, right?
Yeah.
Plus a few decades.
Plus a few decades. So one thing, if I say that, even at the time, God had prepared me so well for that day, and was working in my life before I recognized its existence. But even immediately after it happened, I remember having the thought, from my perspective, obviously this devastated my life. It's the worst thing that's ever happened.
Yeah.
But even at the time, I thought, from God's perspective, not maybe such a bad thing. I mean, he took a pretty innocent young boy, still at that age, 6 years old, had, got into bad things of the world, not, where none of us at 6 years old even are sinless, but he took him to be with him and
Right.
spared him, and he got a hold of me. We were not on a path. Our family wasn't on a path. My wife would have said she was a believer, but wasn't, practicing or doing anything with that really. Neither of my daughters. We didn't go to church at all. We started going to church. Both my girls are strong, committed Christians that are teaching their children about God. Any influence, any good things that I've done in anybody else's life have all stemmed from that. And, who knows how many generations of family now will become Christians because of TJ's death. So from God's perspective, I don't think it was such a bad thing.
No, I agree. And that's a perspective that only God can give you when something like that happens. And you're right. Look at all the lives that, because of what happened, because God chose in his sovereignty to take Terry Jr. home to be with him in heaven, here you are today sharing that story and touching people's lives and offering them hope and encouragement on their grief journey. And not just on this podcast today, but through the grief share groups that you participate in with men and women whose lives that you've touched as you've shared your story over the years. And that's only something that God can do.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
he is so active in our lives. Like I say, I get grief share has strengthened my faith so much because of seeing him in action.
Yeah.
I could tell you so many stories of people that have been, just had people come into their lives or chance meetings or things happen in a Lowe's department, Lowe's home improvement store to one lady, or there are all kinds of things where God just shows up.
Right.
Even in meeting, Jessica, who you know from the previous podcast, and connected with her. Because of her, I now do grief share groups just for people that have had miscarriages or stillbirths or young child loss. And that's proved such a good thing, because those kind of losses, a lot of people just don't give it the same status as losing an older child. They think, it's sad, it's a bad thing, but it's not that big a deal. Well, I call them my kids because they're younger than my kids. The people in those groups, they've lost a child, and it is no different for them than me losing a 6-year-old. But a lot of people don't get that. So when they come together, they understand each other and they support one another, and it's been great. And that all happened just through kind of this, I'll say, chance, through this God-arranged meeting of Jessica and her asking me to do a group for that. So, and I'm sure you have lots of stories, but I just see God just being active all the time in our lives.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned what you did about miscarriage and stillbirth, Terry, because I think you're right. In our culture, we do have a tendency, I think, to minimize that loss. And what we want people to understand, I know you want people to understand, is that whether that child was out of the birth canal or in the birth canal before they, when they died, stillbirth, premature death, in the NICU, the PICU, or when they're 20 years old, it's still the death of a child.
Absolutely.
And for that parent, for those parents, and even siblings as well, it's a pretty traumatic loss and deep, painful process for someone to go through. So thank you for bringing that up. I think the narrative needs to be changed on that in our culture. And conversations like this and ministries like Jessica's do help to change that narrative. And while we're on it, Jessica Sanders is the young lady we're referring to, and the name of her ministry is Praying Through Ministries. So I just wanted to put in a plug for them.
Yeah, she'll appreciate that.
Yeah, it's an incredible ministry. Terry, I wanted to ask you something here. I mean, we're 40 years out from your loss, from when it happened. What do you wish that you had known then that you know now, after having walked this journey, both of grieving and healing for all these decades, that you would say to somebody else who's back in that time that you were 40 years ago?
You know, the biggest thing in my life that I've done more and more as time has passed since then, that I wish I would have done an even better job, is just drawing close to God. I mean,
Yeah.
to allow that loss to just drive us closer to God is really the answer to everything in our lives.
Yeah, that's so true.
And almost everybody I encounter at Grief Share is a Christian at some level of Christian maturity.
Yeah.
You know, I was not at all when it happened. So at the time, you know, in Grief Share, we talk about, you know, people that already know Christ for the most part, but trying to draw closer to him. And in my case, I didn't know him at all until then. So I just nearly threw myself into the Bible and getting to know him and learning about him. And that's what saw me through it in those early days. I think that a loss like I had and like you had and like a lot of the people that would listen to this podcast have, it is awful. I mean, it is often for most people the worst thing that ever happens in their lifetime. But it is also an opportunity to draw closer to God than you ever have before. And it's also an opportunity to see him for who he really is in a way that you've never done before, because I believe we all have a tendency within us to want to make God into who we think he should be, who we want him to be, as opposed to seeking out who he really is. I think it's just part of our human nature to do that. But those false impressions that we may have had about God, mistakes in determining who he is, those things don't hold up when we have a loss. When we have a loss like this, those things don't work for us. The only thing that works is who he really is. And we can get to know him better because of our loss. And I think maybe that's what I want to say to people.
Yeah, and it goes countercultural. You know, it's not what we typically hear from the culture. And the death of a child has this uncanny way of just stripping away everything that is not really valuable. It strips away those false notions. And I think if we lean into it, if we accept the fact that we are now on a grief journey, that our lives will never be the same, but if we lean into God, I have, like you, experienced learning more about the goodness of God. And I think learning more about what really is important in life, because sometimes the things that you think are important, when something like that happens, it casts a light on it that helps you see from a whole different perspective. I know you would agree with that.
Absolutely. It totally helps you prioritize your life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not what we would choose, but he can use that. And as we talked about earlier, man, he can bring so much good out of it if we'll cooperate and let him. And Terry, something else I wanted to ask you, because people are listening that are in all different stages of their grief journey. What surprised you the most about grief?
That's an easy one for me to answer. What surprised me the most was how totally all-encompassing it was, how it invaded every aspect of my life. There was
Yeah,
no part of life that wasn't touched and altered and changed because of it. Future plans, weekend plans, the financial plans, just every aspect of life was touched by it, and I think that surprised me a little bit. Not that I'd ever thought a lot about what it would be, but it was, it was just all encompassing. It impacted every aspect of life, and I think that's, looking back even, that was kind of surprising to me.
yeah, that doesn't surprise me because of having been there myself. But I
Right.
think people on the outside who look in, if they have friends who are family members who have lost a child, and they're trying to figure out how to navigate through those relationships and how they can help and what can I do that doesn't make it worse. I mean, there's just a myriad of things that you think about because at one time you and I were on the other side of that equation as well.
Right.
And I think I appreciate what you shared because I think it helps people understand that there's not any aspect of your life that it doesn't touch. You're never the same person again. It touches every aspect of your being, to every aspect of who you are going forward. So just be aware of that. If you have those people in your life, and don't try to fix them, just be a friend to them, love them, be patient with them, and offer them the gift of your time, your presence. But don't turn them into a project where you want to speed their recovery. You want the old person back again. You're not going to get that person back again. You're going to get a different version of them. And eventually, if you'll stick with them and hang in there with them for the long haul, then you might see a better version of them at some point in the future as God does that healing in them.
Yeah, well said. We deal with that a lot of Grief Share because relationships with friends and family are really impacted by a loss. And just for what it's worth to the listeners here, and kind of repeating a little bit of what you said, the thing that I hear is the most hurtful to people about friends and family after a loss is just not being there. A lot of people withdraw.
Right.
And if I had any advice for people that are going to be around somebody that's had a loss, it would be pretty exactly what you said. Just be there for them. You don't need to try to fix them. You don't even need to talk very much. If they want to talk, they'll lead the conversation. They'll let you know what they want to talk about. But just be there. Your presence means the world to them, and that was true of me. My wife was kind of withdrawn and didn't want people. I was walking around the neighborhood, going into people's houses, talking to them about my son.
Yeah.
And it's different for everybody. That's one of the hard things about being around people that have had a loss is they don't know what to say, and there's good reason for that, because I know you know this, but the very thing I might say to you, Greg, that you'd find helpful and comforting and appreciate that I said it, I can say that exact same thing to Jessica, and she could be offended and hurt by it and not happy at all that I said that. And so it makes it difficult. But I've found if you'll just be there and just listen, be a good listener, not a very good talker,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
let them direct kind of what goes on. They really appreciate that, and regardless of whether they want to talk or don't want to talk, if you do that, your presence there will just be an immense help to them.
Yeah. That's so true. And, if you're one of those who we're talking to that has a friend who has lost a child, I know it's uncomfortable to try to figure out how to navigate that through with them. But man, can you imagine how uncomfortable it is for them? They're the one who lost the child. So it's uncomfortable. Just sit with them for a while. And also remember, if there's something practical that you can do that practical thing for them. Maybe the yard needs to be mowed. Maybe you see a pile of dishes sitting in the sink. Maybe there's a basket of clothes that needs to be washed. Those are things that you can do that will mean a lot to them as well, because those early days, there's the physical impact as well. And there's certainly the mental impact, not just the emotional. Sometimes you're not thinking clearly enough to do anything other than to see that basket of clothes that needs to be washed, but not even know what to do with it and not really care enough to do anything about it, because nothing is right. And it definitely clouds your ability to think coherently at times.
You need to know that that's okay. It's normal. Yep. You're not going crazy. It just comes with the deal.
Yep. It's okay not to be okay for a while.
Right.
So let people in, lean into God. And if you have the ability to, I would certainly encourage our listeners to find a good grief counselor. They are an incredible source of help.
They are. We have a lot of people in Grief Share are doing counseling at the same time. And they both serve a purpose and a place. And so I highly recommend the Grief Share program because it's very biblical based, very godly, and but we also often recommend to people that they seek out counseling as well, especially in certain situations. Trauma, if you've had any kind of trauma, and trauma's not just like a bad car accident that sends you to the hospital. It may be seeing the person as they're dying. It may be, the stillbirth and going through all that. Anything that you'd say is traumatic.
Yeah.
A good Christian counselor will tell you they deal with trauma differently than they deal with grief. But you've got them all mixed up, all kind of connected to one another. And it's hard to separate them, which makes it hard to deal with your grief or with your trauma without untangling them, if that makes some sense. So,
absolutely does.
So we always talk about counseling along with Grief Share, and I think it can be very helpful.
Indeed. Well, Terry, it has been such a pleasure and an honor to have you as a guest today, and to have heard your story about Terry Jr., and your story about how God used something so tragic to draw you into a relationship with his son, Jesus, and to see what he's doing in your life today. And I hope that's an encouragement to someone who's listening today who is in that place where you are in so much pain and you don't think that it's going to ever get any better. That's normal, but as you have heard today, you can find meaning and purpose and hope again on that grief journey. And it's our prayer that what you have heard today will lead you in that direction.
Well, and thank you for allowing me to do this and for the ministry that you do, because people need to hear these things. People need to know that there is hope. People need to know that other people are feeling the same way and going through the same thing. So thank you for what you do.
Yeah, it is a privilege. If you find our podcast meaningful, we invite you to follow us so that you can automatically receive the latest episodes. Also, we'd like to invite you to contact us and talk with us about sharing your story on a future episode, because every story is important and matters to God. Please reach out via email at hope@emptychairendeavor.com. That's hope@emptychairendeavor.com. And as always, thank you so much for listening